Welcome back to Q&A Modeling Bootcamp. In previous lessons, I taught you basic techniques for optimizing your model for Power BI and Q&A. The next step in optimization will be adding phrasings. However, before we move on to the world of phrasings, we first need to take a brief detour through the land of ambiguity to understand why it is that phrasings are so important. So what exactly is ambiguity? Ambiguity is when parts of an utterance can be interpreted in multiple valid ways. Ambiguity is everywhere. Every statement you make, every question you ask, every command you issue is filled with countless ambiguous parts. The utterance itself is ambiguous only if some of those ambiguous parts cannot be resolved. Ambiguity should not be confused with being imprecise or vague. So for example, "Tell me about last year's budget" is unambiguous, but it is vague as it does not indicate precisely what information is being requested. "Call me a taxi," on the other hand, is precise, but highly ambiguous. So where does ambiguity come from? The first source of ambiguity is simply words that have more than one meaning. So for example, in the utterance "Washington apples," Washington could be referring to a city or a state, and apples could be referring to either a fruit or a computer. In the utterance "Who makes money," who could be referring to a branch of the federal government or to the taxpayer, and makes could be referring to printing the money or earning the money. In the utterance "red rose," red could be referring to a color or to communism, and rose could be referring to a flower or to the act of becoming higher. A second source of ambiguity is words that can connect with each other in more than one way. For example, in the phrase "green product container," we could be talking about a container for green products, or we could be talking about a green container for any product. In the phrase "stores owned by young women in Redmond" could be referring to the young women being in Redmond, or it could refer to the stores being in Redmond. In a keyword utterance such as "employees, stores, Chicago," we might have a lot of ambiguity. This could mean the Chicago stores and the employees who work for them, or it could mean the Chicago employees and the stores that they work for. A third source of ambiguity is when the connections between the words are clear, but there could be more than one meaning for the connection. So for example, "customers and their products" could mean customers and the products that they bought, or customers and the products that they reviewed. "Flights for Chicago" could mean flights to Chicago or flights from Chicago. 2012 orders could mean orders that were placed in 2012 or orders that were shipped in 2012. So if ambiguity is everywhere and present in every utterance, how do we resolve it? Resolving ambiguity is ultimately an exercise in mind reading. We have to make a best guess as to what was intended by the person who gave us that utterance. Unfortunately, people with different intents can use precisely the same words, but mean something entirely different by it. All is not lost, however, as we can significantly improve the accuracy of our guesses by using contextual clues and engaging in dialogue. So let's take a look at some of these contextual clues and see how they can be used to reduce ambiguity. The first and most important bit of context is the domain over which the utterance is to be interpreted. By constraining the domain of discourse, we can radically reduce the amount of ambiguity present in practically any utterance. So for example, in the context of a flower shop, the utterance "red rose" is clearly referring to a species of flower and its color, not to the rise of communism. Utilizing domain in this way, however, does depend upon the user understanding that domain and being able to target it appropriately. So for example, if a software engineer were to utilize a flower shop model and ask the question, "How many bugs did Daisy file last week?" he would get an answer involving aphid infestation, not a number of defects in the database. The next contextual clue, which can significantly reduce ambiguity, is the syntax of the utterance. Syntax is essentially the basic grammar rules of language, which define how words are related to one another structurally. For example, I could ask you, how many people with long arms bought tall chairs? Or I could ask, how many tall people bought chairs with long arms? Same words, but different syntax, giving an entirely different meaning. Q&A understands the most common forms of syntax people use and is learning more all the time. But there are some limitations. First, in models without phrasings, Q&A hasn't been taught the ways people talk about the relationships in the model. So while it has a general understanding of syntax, it has to guess how to apply those rules to the specific domain. Second, people vary significantly in their ability and desire to use correct grammar. It's hard to use syntax as a clue when them rules are be broke. Third, internet search has trained people not to use syntax at all, instead collapsing all data requests into keyword searches. In this case, syntax doesn't help. Another part of context that can help with ambiguity resolution is semantics, the meanings behind relationships between things. The more closely related two things are to each other, the more likely that's what was meant. So for example, if I were to ask you about customers, cars, and hair color, it would be reasonable for you to assume that I meant the hair color of the customer, not the hair color of the salesperson who sold the car to the customer. There are some more advanced contextual clues that Q&A does not currently use in order to resolve ambiguity that are worth noting. For example, conversational history. If a user starts off asking for people from Idaho who bought Volvos, and follows that up by asking for Utah customers who bought Audis, they are probably referring to the customers who are from Utah. However, if they start off with a question, people who bought Volvos in Idaho, and follow up with the same question, Utah customers who bought Audis, they're probably talking about customers who bought in Utah. Prosody can also be used for disambiguation. Prosody is the pauses and emphasis in an utterance when spoken. So for example, if I told you to put the book on the chair in the library, I'd like you to take the book that is currently on the chair and put it somewhere in the library. Whereas if I said, put the book on the chair in the library, it's clear that the final destination for the book is on a chair that is currently in the library. There's also cultural context that can be used for disambiguation. If someone asked for Canadian hockey medals, you can probably guess that they meant ice hockey, not field hockey. Similarly, if I say that Joe will be home from work at 8, it's more likely that I meant PM, not AM. Finally, we can also use personal facts or geographical knowledge in order to disambiguate. So if I told you that I drove to Portland yesterday, and you happen to know that I live in Washington State, then you can probably guess that I mean Portland, Oregon, not Portland, Maine. There are countless times, however, when context is simply not enough to disambiguate an utterance. In those situations, the task of resolving ambiguity falls to dialogue. This is a natural human impulse, to engage in conversation when you're not sure what the other person meant, rather than blindly assuming that your guesses are correct. Dialogue comes in a number of forms, which I'll illustrate with an example. If you were to ask me, "What do you have for lunch?" you might not realize that's a highly ambiguous question, so I can respond in a number of ways. For example, I can state my assumptions back to you in the answer itself. Today I'm eating pizza. Or I can reword my interpretation of your question back to you unambiguously. What am I eating for lunch today? Pizza. Or I could first ask you clarifying questions before attempting to answer. Do you mean which food I eat, or what meetings I attend? Do you mean today, or usually? Or I can give you the answer to my best guess regarding what you meant, and follow that up with alerting you to the ambiguity you might not have been aware of. Today I'm eating pizza. Or did you mean what I usually eat? Or which meetings I'm attending today? Or I can give you an answer to every question I think you might reasonably have meant. Today I'm eating pizza and attending a cost planning meeting, but usually I eat a sandwich and attend no meetings. Q&A today uses only the second approach, rewording the question unambiguously, but in the future may utilize a combination of these techniques. So why can't people just say what they mean? Why don't people naturally construct unambiguous utterances and avoid all these problems? First, it's hard. People are simply bad at recognizing ambiguity in what they say. They have inside their heads a vast amount of context that isn't necessarily available to the listener. They know perfectly well what they meant, and have a hard time understanding how what they said sounds to another person, or in this case computer, who doesn't have all their internal context. And even when they do notice the ambiguity, it's quite difficult to quickly go back and alter the utterance to fix it. Second, it's wordy. Precise, unambiguous utterances tend to be exceptionally long and often involve complex nested syntax that is uncommonly used in everyday speech and often sounds unnatural to the listener. Enough said. Third, people are inherently good at the sorts of advanced contextual ambiguity resolution I described earlier. In addition, people are naturally social communicators. So using dialogue to resolve ambiguity is an integral part of how we live, and we get an awful lot of practice at it. As a result, there's very little incentive to become good at constructing unambiguous utterances. So how often will Q&A fail at its task of resolving ambiguity? That depends on a number of things. First, it depends on the type of utterances issued by the users. Keyword utterances are naturally more ambiguous and will rely more heavily on dialogue restatement to alert the user to misinterpretation. At the other end of the spectrum, extremely complex questions can exceed the capabilities of Q&A's current grammar and will need to be simplified by the user. Second, it depends on the content of the model. Models with unambiguous data values and unique column names will naturally have fewer problems with ambiguity of terms. In addition, models with simpler join structure, such as a star or snowflake schema, will have less semantic ambiguity. Finally, it depends on the linguistic schema. In general, the more phrasings you add, the fewer opportunities there are for syntactic ambiguity. So next time, I'll teach you what exactly phrasings really are and how to build them.